Welcome, everybody, to a special episode of The Created Economy. It's our weekly interview series where we chat with players from the creator economy at large and discuss the key topics impacting the growth of the industry. I'm your host, Ken Yeung, and I'm joined by my good friend, Greg Narain. Hello, Greg. How's it going?
What's up, everybody?
All
Good to be
right.
here. We haven't done a
Yes.
live one in ages now.
Yes, it had. Oh, geez. It's been, I think the last one was in 2021.
You remember how to push all the buttons? You sure?
Not really. Not really. I'm bound to make a bunch of mistakes. But before we get to our guest today, I wanted to kind of do a little bit of housekeeping here. So this is The Created Economy. You can find new episodes of our show on Wednesdays at our website, on YouTube, and everywhere you listen to podcasts. Go to createdeconomy.com for more information. And if you want to be a guest on our show, there's a form for you to fill out at createdeconomy.com/guest list. And if you like the show, please be sure to give it a like and a subscribe. Nice little segue into our guest today. We're Created Economy everywhere on Twitter, LinkedIn, Flipboard, and Twitch. And speaking of Flipboard, that's actually where you can find more specific Created Economy news that we are curating every day of the week. All right, Greg, what's going on, man? How are you digging life so far?
Busy times right now. Seems like the market is waking up a little bit in the startup world. ETH is pumping. I think everyone's waiting for all of their bags to double. With the merge or the switch to proof of work, and I think that's going to be an interesting time as well. So yeah, lots going on today in the creator economy and Web3. Yeah, it's a great time right now.
Nice. All right, let's cease the useless babble. We'll dive right in. All right, in this episode, we welcome journalist Mark Bergen to the show. He's a technology reporter for Bloomberg News and Business Week. He covers all of Google's innovations, successes, and scandals. He's the author of a new book coming out soon, actually next month, called Like, Comment, Subscribe, which looks at the history of YouTube. Today, we'll talk to Mark about his reporting, any surprises that he reveals. Hopefully, we can dig some good scoops out of that. The relationship YouTube has with the creators, and much more. Plus, if you have any questions, feel free to tweet it to us. Drop it in the comments. We're live on Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn, so feel free to let us know what questions you have for Mark, and we'll try and get him to answer them. Everyone, please welcome to the show, Mark Bergen. Hey, Mark, how's it going?
Hello. Thanks for having me.
No worries. Thanks for being here. So, Mark, what is your fascination with Google and YouTube? Like, weren't there other companies out there that are much more interesting?
I beg to differ. My fascination with Google, I came out to the Valley in 2015 with Recode. Karen Walt, a few years after Karen Walt kind of taking all things D into Recode. They hired me to be a Google reporter. From before that, I was working with this magazine called Ad Age. And so I knew a fair amount of like the nuts and bolts of Google's business, and joined really that I was like, okay, I kind of understand the advertising world. I need to like learn everything else about Google, and eventually became the Alphabet empire. At that point in 2015, which feels as like decades ago in internet years, YouTube was sort of a Hollywood story, right? And it was pretty. It wasn't front and center in a lot of these like platform and social media discussions. That fast forward a couple of years into the Trump elections, and that clearly changed. And I thought that was just. It became arguably, and I'd say, one of the most interesting and fascinating parts of Google. Certainly for like I think it's the most interesting business at Google, and I think it's also clearly the most fascinating for like social and political, you name it, sort of complications. And no one had done a journalistic treatment of YouTube before, and so I thought I'd give it a shot.
So most people, when you look at the most recent tech-specific books that have been out there, Super Pumped by your former colleague Mike Isaac, now at the New York Times. He focused on a specific area of Uber's founding. Same thing, with Brad Stone. With Amazon, it's focused on a specific part of Amazon. You kind of didn't go that route, right? You went in this nearly 400 pages, kind of dissected nearly 2 decades of YouTube's experience, all like, and you went into pretty good detail into that. Why did you decide to just air everything out as opposed to just focusing on a particular area?
Well, I just throw it all in. I mean, I think Brad's book, The Everything Store, and then his follow-up book, both, I'd argue that they kind of did a pretty comprehensive snapshot of all of Amazon's business. His most recent book went from like everything from Whole Foods to AWS, and I think there's yes, I think part of the reason was just to really understand on some of the, say, if you're doing a story about like some of the issues that YouTube's had with brand safety since starting in 2017 and sort of the creator controversy. I think going back and understanding the beginning of their creator business and going back even further and understanding some of the like early copyright issues and legal struggles that YouTube had, and it's like merging and meshing with Google was really important. That was a part of the reason. I mean, listen, there's a lot that I left. I know it's, you point out it's a long book. There's a lot I left out, unfortunately. Like it's mostly US focused, and YouTube, as you know, is a big global service. And so I really hope someone picks up and writes a book about YouTube in India, YouTube in Russia, YouTube in Brazil. Like there's so much there that's just been unexplored. So, I'd argue still limited scope.
Yeah. And that was actually a question as I was jotting down notes over the course of reading the book. I was jokingly telling you like, oh, I have so many questions for you. And I think of like almost 30 questions I wanted to ask you. Of course, obviously we won't get to them in this hour. But one of the last questions I asked was, yes, there was a lot of US specific insights into YouTube. So I was curious, like, had you thought about what the implications of YouTube were outside of the 50 states, right? I mean, how does this impact in, what's YouTube's role in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, and so on and so forth? I mean, did you do some preliminary research into that and then decide you need to cut it down?
Yeah, and so the book does talk a little bit about Europe in particular. Europe is where I like YouTube and Google got into the most like the regulatory problems, and I think a lot of where their early problems, issues around terrorism contents, for instance, was much more aggressive in Europe, and a lot of the initial sort of pressure they got from politicians was coming out of Europe. That's where, like, if you recall the brand history, the big 2017, where these extended, every single YouTube creator around then remembers this, the adpocalypse. That started in Europe. It started with the Times of London publication. It started with a lot of pressure both from ad agencies and then politicians in Europe. And look at the future of Europe now, I think there's still a lot more likelihood that these tech platforms are going to be regulated there and have a much more complicated and thorny business than in the US. I did a little bit of reporting. I spent some time like a decade ago in India and still love the country dearly. And India is super fascinating for YouTube because its TikTok was banned there. And so YouTube was huge to begin with. I think the stat YouTube has more users in India than Twitter has users around the world, which is bonkers how much we think to talk about Twitter. So there's some stuff in India in there, and obviously I wish there's a lot of space for more.
Yeah. One more question before I toss it over to Greg. Out of all the reporting that you've done, what are some of the things that surprised you in your reporting?
A couple of things that were interesting about early YouTube that was surprising to me. One is this, it was this early startup period, really kind of the rocket ship, right? Like the first 18 months before it was bought by Google. And it had this this was sort of, I knew this, right? But what I didn't appreciate was that all the early creators, they were coming on. There was no guarantee there was no way for them to make money on the platform this first couple of years. Two, there was no guarantee it was actually there was no such thing as an influencer, right? And really as an online creator. And so you had people coming on, either they were trying to be aspiring filmmakers or comedians, or just hobbyists, or like a lot of them were just kind of like tinkering with this creative canvas in this way. And listen, I mean, clearly in the past 15 years, the creator economy is just gone from 0 to 60. But I thought that was really interesting in those first 5 years, how so many YouTubers didn't have a guaranteed any like economic guarantees, right? They were kind of coming on for like the joy of the platform. The second one is that YouTube, the company, was pretty late in coming around to creators, which I'm happy to get into more. Their first few years, they actually spent so much time, like the business model they thought was, okay, we're going to get TV networks and studios like onto YouTube. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to have like the premium quality content that advertisers want. And so that was really interesting to me, just because I was not reporting on them or paying attention to that really when that happened.
Cool. Greg, what questions you got for Mark?
Yeah, Mark, great to chat, and thanks for joining us today. And I'll probably riff a little bit, I guess, on what you were just speaking about. You touched on, actually, you sort of made a comment at the beginning, like you think YouTube is probably one of Google's most interesting businesses. Finances aside, I'd love for you to unpack that a little bit more. Like, what else is so special about YouTube, I guess, right? And ultimately, to follow, I think, you mentioned that they weren't focused on creators. However, the word creator was baked at YouTube, right? Like they were the ones who sort of started calling these folks creators. And so I'd love to get like a chance to talk a little bit more about, I think, some, not the economics, but I think the adversity that seems to now be emerging. Today, YouTube is one of the best places to get paid as a creator today, bar none. It is the most advantageous for creators, in spite of all the things and the gripes and the belly aching that may exist. I'm kind of curious what your take is now on sort of, as we're seeing this transition to be your own platform, et cetera, all these other things. There's a backlash, like we were being robbed somehow this whole time. And I'm kind of curious your reflections now on, on that change and how it's sort of like how you think it might have come to be.
Yeah, I mean, when I said the most interesting part, I'm a business reporter, so if you listen to like the Google earnings call and have to sit through that, then you'll easily understand why talking about YouTube's 10 times more interesting than talking about like ad tech and like hedging for currency tailwinds or something. No offense to Google CFO. Your second part of your question, absolutely. There was as far as like that Google sort of YouTube birthed the creator economy. I think it was around. It wasn't until like 2010 or 2011 when they actually started using that term. Mm-hmm. There was a team called the Next New Networks, which is a really interesting. Like some of them, some of them gone on to have Vanessa. Oh God, I'm so sorry. I'm blanking on her last name. She's right now running the operations for TikTok. She was part of the Next New Networks team, and that was like an early, online digital video sort of team. And they came in, and at that point, like YouTube was still, they called them YouTubers, right? They just called everyone a user, whether you were a viewer. And to a certain extent, in the early days, like I don't think this is necessarily true, but it felt like a lot of people that were also using were uploading videos. Mm-hmm. Whereas today, like most people who are watching YouTube are not uploading videos. So yeah, I think to address your second part of your question, like for sure it has been, it's been a rocky ride, but like they got on early and they built in the system and they invested in a way that no other platform really had. Like Facebook has been talking about paying creators for almost a decade, right? And like, there's no evidence that they're doing that at scale. Yeah. YouTube has done that, to their credit, I think. And now you're looking at sort of all these, the creator economies in many ways, like trying to replicate some of YouTube's success. I think that we don't talk enough about like the potential hurdles to that in like the content moderation side and the complications about like, demonetization and tools and methods for that. I think if other company platforms follow YouTube, they're going to repeat the same exact mistakes. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think probably the closest to YouTube is then probably Twitch, right? But Twitch has horrible terms also, right? I do think most people underestimate how complicated it is to, I think I remember reading an article once that YouTube had like 1,000 people specifically just working to help creators place work. And, it was like an active sales force, almost like highly engaged with their top creators, like actually actively working with them.
Yeah. I mean, whatever that number is, it's too small, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Arguably too small. I think that, and then it's, they have a senior partner managers that work with, I don't know if there's a fast like rule of thumb for that, but like a certain, if you're a mega creator with a huge number of subscribers, I think, TikTok's having a version of this same problem, right? Where I don't know if there was some stat about the number of TikTok, TikTok creators with certainly a million or plus more, right? Like YouTube had they went through the same thing where there was at one point like a pretty small number of people with a sizable number of million plus subscribers, and now that number is huge, right? And so like managing and like giving resources to creators is not something that YouTube has excelled at. For a long time, it like basically outsourced it to MCNs, to multi-channel networks.
Yeah.
The book goes through that like middle years of the sort of wild west of like the Hollywood YouTube studios that were going to reinvent media, and a lot of them like sort of got ahead of their skis, and many of them like don't exist anymore.
Yeah, I had many MCN clients. I know that space pretty well. I guess to riff on that, then the MCN model does seem to have sort of some resurgence, not necessarily in the formalized way of MCNs, but like now they're called collabs.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are houses organizing and facilitating, or there are houses also, which are also, in their own ways, MCNs to some degree. Do you see YouTube readjusting, I guess, to sort of incorporate that more, wholeheartedly into the platform?
I think so. I mean, during like the short version of the story with MCNs, they like exploded under YouTube's nose, and YouTube didn't even see it coming, right? Like just that, initially MCNs were sort of, they came about because there was a limited number of YouTube's creators that were allowed in the partner program, the AdSense system, right? And then like MCNs sort of, I have this really great anecdote in the book about that, like sort of accidental eureka moment where like Machinima, which was at one point a really big gaming studio, MCN, sort of discovered that they could collate a bunch of different YouTube channels into their same content management system. And then that became the like the MO for these MCNs, where we're to like sign up as many channels as possible, right? And then basically just pool the ad money they're getting. And then eventually YouTube really changed their mind and thought that a lot of MCNs were pretty exploitative. Like I have one source in the book that describe them as parasites. And I think that they're now, with these new waves of companies working and managing creators, I do think YouTube's hopefully being a lot more careful about, like, there were some characters like in the MCN world that came in and had like really flimsy, like signed up young creators on these contracts that they did, like the creators didn't know what they were getting into, right? And the MCNs didn't know what they were getting into, and then YouTube changed the rules, and like basically that a lot of that industry imploded. So I think that YouTube is smarter about it, and I think a lot of these people who are involved in these companies are treading more carefully and like having a bit more mature, if we use that word.
I mean, it seems like the MCNs, as I'm reading the book and hearing you talk about the progression of MCNs and the interactions with YouTube and everything that you're talking about, how some MCNs took advantage of creators. It reminded me of IOI, that loyalty center in the movie Ready Player One, right? It almost seems like these MCNs are equivalent to that. Would that be a fair thing? I mean, I'm not saying that all MCNs were predatory. I mean, there's always the small amount that were, but it almost seemed like that was the case. Like, hey, let's bring in as much talent as we can, and some take full advantage of them and exploit them.
Can I be totally honest with you? I'm from Columbus, Ohio. I think where the book and movie takes place, but I haven't watched the movie, so I can't.
Dude, it is Gregarious games. So,
but yeah, I mean, it's like there were some devastating moments about that MCNs like sort of exploiting creators, and then talk to people at MCNs, and they're like, hey, YouTube changed the rules of the road for us without telling us, right? Or YouTube like copied our features. And then YouTube like changed the ads system, and the big change was basically the MCNs for a long time were like, not for a long time, but for several years they were the place where you could be monetized, and then YouTube like opened the floodgates and like anyone can monetize basically, right? And then for a variety of reasons, like Maker sold to Disney, Full Screen was another big one. We got part of AT&T, Warner Media, like a lot of these Maker, as far as I understand it, Disney like doesn't really exist anymore. And so that may be the fault of YouTube, of Maker, or of Disney. There's depends on who you talk to there. I thought like Makers, I spent a lot of time with in the book with Maker because there's just a lot of great characters there. And they were also like, they were founded on this idea that like not just that that creators themselves would be like the owners of the studio, right? Which is a very like YouTube idea, right? Like at the time, it's still like we don't appreciate, I think, how revolutionary it is that like creators own the IP. They get to determine, they're the directors and producers, and there's no like, early YouTube was really like, we don't need a producer, we don't need agents, we don't need managers, right? Like YouTube, we can go straight to the audience. And that was pretty a revolutionary idea at the time. And Maker's idea was we can also like run an entire studio, right? That didn't quite work out for them, their initial vision.
So it would basically be and I guess that post Google acquisition, when you have the MCNs, it was almost like a transformation of sorts of Hollywood, of modern, of the current entertainment industry, just bringing it in where instead of television, YouTube is television, right? And you start to see all these like the Sony pictures of the world of these creators kind of being the new like Maker or Machinima or all these other ones here. So that's fascinating. But
yeah, I mean, there's at the same time, YouTube, I don't spend too much time on this, but there's another, go back to your point, Ken, like that there's another book that could be done just on like YouTube's originals, right? Like YouTube at one point was trying to do their own sort of version of like take on Netflix and Amazon and the streamers. I think it was earlier this year that they shut that program down, right? And they pivoted direction, and you could like, there have been a few sort of like initially, I think the people inside YouTube thought like, oh, this will be a pedestal. They talked about it as like an SNL model, right? Where like you come up on YouTube and then you kind of jump up to the next stage in film and like TV and movies.
Yeah.
Issa Rae is a really good example of that. Like they're not as many though. And in part because like they don't need, like, does Mr. Beast need to be in TV and movies? Like, no, he's totally doing fine on YouTube, right? And so like the platform itself is fine for a lot of creators and ultimately a place where like they feel like they can have a lot more control than in like traditional Hollywood.
Yeah, I want to kind of bring up a separate point that's related to that, but something that I've been dying to ask is the multiple story arcs that you have in this book, right? I mean, you talk about obviously the whole book, the premise is about YouTube's history, from 2017-ish on to 2022, almost 2023. But it scattered throughout the book.
2005.
2000, yeah. Math is hard. It's been 20 some years. I can't do math. Go figure. But you look at as you read it, it's centered on so many different characters in there as well, right? Can you explain the logic behind you're reading this history, and then all of a sudden you see, oh, here's PewDiePie, and then all of a sudden Claire Stapleton, Hank Green, and you kind of think, oh, these are people. Obviously, these are real life people, but the mentions of them, you just feel like they're just anecdotes. But over the course of this book reading, like they actually play pretty big roles in YouTube's history. Can you walk why you included them?
I mean, part of it was a narrative. Like YouTube it's trying to capture some of the spirit of like the platform, which is just like like impossibly wide, right?
Right.
Like YouTube is so big, right? Like every single day you could find a new niche on YouTube that's just like, oh wow, there's like dozens of like creators here that are putting out like quality like material that millions of people watching. We have there's like a bunch of subcultures, right? Like I think that's what's really fascinating about the platform. And so I think part of it was to try to capture that in the book, right? There's not a central like there's not like a central, it's not like TV in the sense that like, okay, we only have a limited number of hours that we can program, and so we're gonna like choose these shows, right? It's like YouTube is massive, and that's part of its economic advantage, and that's part of its like sort of discombobulated chaos that I wanted to capture a little bit. I think the storylines when the company, one thing I think is, I hope readers will find interesting is, but like is in some ways like a little bit of a challenge in telling a story of YouTube is like, okay, I think if you like find the average Joe on the street and ask them about YouTube, right? They like can name a bunch of creators or videos that they watch. Like ask them to name who runs YouTube, right? They probably get silence. And then it's YouTube is the only social platform that really doesn't have like a founder that's been there. Jack Dorsey's gone now, but Jack Dorsey's like basically been at Twitter the entire time. Like Zuckerberg is Facebook, right? Like Evan Spiegel is Snapchat. The YouTube founders, there were 3, and then like 2, and then they left pretty early on. There was an intermediate YouTube CEO for a few years, and then Susan Wojcicki's run it since 2014. But like most people don't know who Susan is.
Right.
And I think that was a reporting challenge for sure, and like a narrative challenge in some ways. And I think the story of YouTube is, certainly Susan's a really important person and character and executive, and her decisions matter. But what I was also trying to get across is that like she's, when there's an anecdote, a source told me like she's just holding on the reins to this like much larger beast that is the platform.
Yeah. So one more question, and I'll turn it back to Greg. Is you talked about the early on, like the history. I think when I first, the acquisition between Google of YouTube by Google happened before I started reporting as a journalist for the Next Web. But I remember reading about it, and I'm like, holy crap! Like YouTube got bought for over $1 billion. That's absolutely mind-boggling. And you kind of saw like just on the surface, here's how it went down, right? I think tech journalism, tech blogging was still very much in its infancy at that point. And then you get into, as I'm reading the book, you do a lot of deep dives and a lot of good insightful reporting into this. And I didn't realize how big of a cluster Google's own efforts with Google Video was. So I'm curious, had Google not made that acquisition, would YouTube still be what it is today? Would it have succeeded, or would it might have failed?
Yeah, I love this. I'm like, I feel like the next book would be like, historical fiction about tech or something, right? We can all write all sorts of like storylines of like, what if YouTube didn't go to Google? What if Instagram stayed independent, right? What if like Musical.ly was bought by LinkedIn? To answer your question, I think like there's 2 different cases that people argued, and I think both could be true. One is that YouTube would have been sued out of existence had Google not stepped in. Briefly in March of 2007, which was like less than 6 months after the acquisition of YouTube from Google, Viacom sued YouTube for $1 billion for copyright infringement, and that became like this massive headache and shaped a lot of the YouTube. I think still currently it's one of the most important aspects for like shaping the corporate DNA and a lot of its business and operations. Could YouTube have survived as an independent company? Like maybe. I think certainly like Sequoia was an early investor, and I think there's some VCs that wish that like, oh, YouTube could have been independent and a bigger entity, and maybe could have like explored different business models, which is what they were talking about sort of pre-Google, right? Like premium features and kind of getting into what YouTube is now doing, like with all what they call alternative monetization, right? Like merchandising and all these sort of opportunities that aren't just based on ads. And I think part of it is Google's like, okay, we know the ads business, like we have AdSense, it works for like websites, we're just gonna like stick it on the YouTube, which worked. So yeah, I mean, I can entertain the idea that it's certainly like, I think YouTube would not be what it is today at scale without Google's. Like for YouTube was, this is hard to decipher in my reporting, but for a long time, like YouTube was just losing money, like bleeding money.
Yeah.
It's like, it was a loss leader for Google, right? And as an independent company, as a startup, like it probably couldn't have afforded to do that, especially back then. Maybe it could today. But.
Did you ever could you posit a guess on why, Google Video, what was Google doing wrong with Google Video versus what YouTube was doing? I mean, obviously, that there's the lawsuits and other content concerns with YouTube, but what was it that kind of really hindered Google Video?
Yeah, part of it was like Google, even at that stage, like they'd just gone public in 2004. And so they were still young, but they were they had this lawsuit, another lawsuit about Google Books. And so that I think that was part of the caution with they, initially when they dipped their toes in sort of user generated content. We don't call it that anymore, but they were like they wanted to screen everything. And so like I had this, it's like if someone posts something at Google Video on a Friday night, like they're not going to see it up on the site until Monday morning because like Google at the time didn't have someone working weekend shift, right? Like, at YouTube, it's just instantaneous. I think, and then there were a bunch of like features. There were social features that YouTube had. Like, I think it is a kind of a classic Silicon Valley story in some sense of like YouTube was scrappier, faster, a little more reckless, and that's a main reason why they not just Google Video, but at the time there were like a bunch of web video competitors, and YouTube just like leapfrogged them all.
Gotcha. Greg?
Yeah, well, it's been very interesting to hear, I guess, about the past. I guess, as we look now to the future, one observation is there seems to be a bit of this parity race that's going on, everyone trying to catch up and mimic and emulate kind of fairly horizontally in the space. I guess, knowing, like you mentioned, originals has sort of been shut down, MCNs are shut down. What do you think are the tendrils of the new YouTube, right? The thing that provides like sort of that sustainability, that edge to go forward. And if I can, there's a couple of areas that I'm kind of keen on for your take on. It seems like there is a cottage industry that does exist around YouTube itself now, downstream from the collaborative efforts, all the work that goes into actually producing content, et cetera, taking out these sort of management parts, right? And then also, like, how do you see Web3 kind of playing into the future or the ecosystem, sort of as a whole?
So the first part of the question was like,
yeah,
where are they sort of like?
Where do you think they're going, or what do you see, happening next?
So I mean, like three main areas, I guess, is like Shorts, which is their TikTok comparison, and they're like, or there's a TikTok rival. They're like putting a bunch of. I think TikTok is, this new rival that YouTube really hasn't seen before because it's both sides of the market. It's like competing for viewers and creators. And so like they're throwing a lot of resources into Shorts. They're about to turn the switch on at some point for monetization for Shorts, and like be really interesting to see how that happens. I don't think they figured out just the ad format. They figured out like how to pay creators for that. I think there's a lot of open questions there, but the Hank Green made a really compelling video about this that was great about the problems with TikTok's current creator funds. And I think the expectation from creators and certainly from like people who spend around time around YouTube is that like the one thing YouTube does do pretty well is monetization, and like I think they'll be able to figure that out. Commerce is another big focus for them. I think that's a little bit more of an open question, really. Like, it's like the uncanny valley thing. Like, how close do you get to like QVC before like turning people off, right? I think YouTube moves very slowly on things, which frustrates people inside the company. But I think that I wouldn't see them like basically doing what Instagram is doing now and like frustrating their users, right? And YouTube can kind of afford to move slowly on that. So I think commerce is something that they're putting a lot of resources into, but I feel like they might move slowly on that part. And I think to answer your Web3 thing, like, earlier this year, Susan Wojcicki said that YouTube was going to explore NFTs. That was around the big hype bubble for NFTs. Sorry, I won't use that word. The big hype cycle for NFTs. They haven't thus far. It's almost September. They haven't announced anything. It's like who knows if that's still going to happen. If there's a lot of interest in like creators for using NFTs. And I think the third area is TV. Like they've been hitting that for the past several years as far as like to both like the YouTube TV product, they're like streaming over the top service, and then like the number of hours watched YouTube on television screens. And that message is clearly to their advertisers, which is like, people are watching this on the big screen. Like, you should be giving us big screen money. And I think a lot of like the feature, they're going to start bringing like more of the sort of YouTube feature set into TVs, which will be really interesting. The Journal had a really good report last week about that YouTube's prepping for like to it sounded like basically, according to the Journal, launch something like a channels in the YouTube app that where people can like watch if they're subscribed to Netflix and HBO, and like a very, very googly approach there, which is like, we want to be everything to every, like horizontal, like get as many, be a platform for where like your people are spending time, and then we can, like you go to Google Maps, it's like, oh, I can take an Uber and a Lyft here. It's the same sort of experience for YouTube.
Cool.
I guess a little more. I guess one little follow up there. Mm-hmm. Of those things, do you still imagine advertising though is still, the lion's share, like 70-80%, or are all those things in service of advertising ultimately still, I guess, right? Or do you think independence of
YouTube doesn't share their non-advertising revenue, so I think I would guess ads is even upwards of 90% more or more. But the short answer is like ads are going to be decreasing part of that pie, and part of it's because of what Apple's done with ad targeting, right? And that's like kneecapped Facebook and Snap. I think it's hurt YouTube, but we just don't have a lot of visibility into it because YouTube's like kind of tucked inside the Alphabet empire, right? Mm-hmm. And so we don't have a clear sense of like their profit and loss. That's like the future of digital advertising is not as what it was the past 2 decades. That's pretty like evidently clear, and even if like the Congress and the DOJ doesn't do anything about regulating this area, like it's just Apple's movement and like the general push towards privacy means that YouTube is going to have to figure out new forms of revenue besides ads if they want to continue the growth.
So why don't we talk a little bit more about, how YouTube has treated creators? I think in the social realm and social platforms, you hear these horror stories, right? You see how Black creators are have protested against TikTok because of appropriation of their dances. You hear, other creators in general complaining like, oh, I'm not getting like, oh, Twitter's efforts aren't good enough, or link, I'm not doing, I'm not getting enough money off of TikTok. Obviously, a lot of the outrages against, payouts from these platforms, same thing like has been same claim has been levied against Snap for their programs. As I read the book, there's certainly a lot of outreach that's being done by YouTube over the course of their history to get creators on their platforms. As Susan Wojcicki told you or said that, she thinks that creators are the heart of YouTube. But I'm reading it, and like you have the cool hunters, you have the YouTube head team, all these people going out and reaching to these popular creators, and they're generating amazing views, and then YouTube just makes all these changes, such as algorithm changes, changing of what's the important metric. I think what time viewed is now, and whatever these tweaks. Every time they make a tweak, they think, hey, YouTube, we're making one step forward, but they're taking 2 steps back because creators are complaining that their visibility, the people that are watching it, their videos, their work is gone or has been diminished, right? And then so they become frustrated, and then something I appreciated that you pointed out is, in a sense, burnout. Some of these creators got burnt out by trying to keep up with the algorithm. So would it be fair to say, so 2-part question. One, can you talk about general thoughts on the treatment of creators over the course of YouTube's history? And 2, would it be accurate to say that creators are not producing content for viewers, they're producing content for an algorithm? And so it's that they have a different master.
Yeah, I mean, YouTube creators in some ways are like some of the earliest like gig economy workers, right? I think in the sense that like there's no guaranteed that next month your views are going to hit a certain number, or your like AdSense payment's going to be a certain amount, right? And to be fair, like there have been many like careers launched and new businesses, and we're seeing that. I think, and YouTube's made a lot of headway in their relationships with creators. From my sense, from like talking to a lot, at least some of the like larger ones, and maybe the grain of salt there is like they're the ones that have access to like Casey Neistat's of the world, like can talk to Susan, can talk to like partner managers, right? Like there's a certain class of creators that have access to tools and resources, and like if something goes haywire, right? And like for a vast majority of creators, like you basically are interacting with like an email bot if you're lucky.
Yep.
But I do think like they put in a lot more tools in the past, certainly the past 5 years, especially after they had this major crisis. And so like the short version of the story is like, YouTube opened up the system in 2012. It was like anyone can make money with their ads partner program. 5 years later, advertisers like started boycotting over inappropriate material. There's a debate about how much to the extent of like advertisers were just trying to get leverage with Google, which I think is totally true, and creators were sort of collateral damage in this fight. But YouTube hadn't figured out basically like they had to keep these three constituents, right, both viewers, advertisers, and creators, pretty happy in order for their business to work. They've done a lot of adjustments around that. I think now, certainly with TikTok and with Instagram moving, and Spotify and Twitch, like all these platforms throwing in money, like Patreon's presence has been, I think, like a really good competitive force for creators on YouTube, as far as like YouTube paying a lot more attention to creators because of Patreon, for sure. And I think that the same way that like, I was talking to someone who used to work at YouTube, was like, we used to be, the company was so like tilted towards advertisers, and if you talk to creators, they might still say that, but now it feels like it's sort of tilted back a little bit towards creators. That being said, like I would love to see the stats. I don't have it, but how top heavy is like viewership and money in the YouTube creator economy? Like how much of it is kind of going to the 1% of creators, right?
Yeah.
I'd be really curious to see what that distribution looks like and how that's changed over time.
Okay. Would you, at one point, YouTube said, according to your reporting, that Facebook was its biggest competitor. Would you say that's accurate now? I mean, obviously, a lot of the news, yeah.
Well, they're called Meta, Ken.
Well, okay. So clearly, the outdated reference.
Yeah.
But would you say that's Meta and it's all its platforms, or would it be TikTok?
Yeah, I mean, I think first, I think that Facebook is still a threat. I don't think like we discount them. I don't know. I'll give you like a sort of hot take answer in some ways. Like, I do think you talk to like people in the ads world at Google and YouTube. It's like TV. Like that's still like the time spent on TV. Like the amount of like if their core business is advertising, which still is, like the amount of advertising money going to TV is still disproportionate with the amount of time people spend on YouTube, right? And I think that's like the share of the pie that they're going after. It's like their main, like you and me are not. Unless you're paying for YouTube Premium, you're basically getting it for free. Like their customer is the advertiser, and the advertiser is like spending money on TV and moving it over to digital, and YouTube's like, why are you spending money on TV? And I think like now Netflix and Disney and these streamers might be moving into, and I think that's going to be an interesting competitive landscape. I do think like Amazon with Twitch and Amazon moving into advertising is a really fascinating and potentially another new competitor to YouTube that we don't think about as much. Mm-hmm. So, but TikTok obviously is like if you look at shorts is like a competitive response to TikTok.
Has there been, I think something that's been outlined in this book in many parts is that YouTube kind of really hasn't figured out in its growth stage, hasn't quite figured out what it stands for, right? Mm-hmm. You talked about there's one quote in here that says, somebody said, are we a media company? Are we a tech company? I think that's a common question that companies such as, Meta, Twitter, and Google all face. At some point, people are like, oh, is Uber a transportation company or are they a tech company?
Mhm.
Right. And then there's obviously the regulatory concerns, a perceived conservative bias, all these other claims. Has Google figured out its existential crisis? Or is it still one of those ongoing type of things?
So yeah, I mean that quote came from when they first started funding channels. Like YouTube started to give like in 2011. So that, that crisis has been going on for a while. I think that's something that people like in the conversations about tech platforms often forget is like, oh, YouTube's really the one where there's like substantial money involved, right? And they have this lever that other companies don't have, where they can like take your money away, right? As a creator, and like that's a powerful mechanism. I think like as far as YouTube has this amazing gift of being like trying to be all things to all people, and often they succeed, right? Like they, like Susan talks about how creators are the heart of YouTube, and at the same time, like they want record labels and they want like TV, right? And like they want they're starting to run more movies on YouTube. Like they want to be everything, right? They want and they want to be as comprehensive as the internet. This is Google we're talking about, right? Their business model is like making the world like, God, I forgot the logo. Open and organizing the world's information, right? Like they just think about things in scale and search, and like this is what YouTube does really well. So I think like people talk to people, they don't necessarily think that that's a existential crisis at all, right? It's just like how can we sort of smooth out the bumps of content moderation and regulatory problems. I mean, I think like as far as if they're going to be a place for creators, it's really hard to be that and to also be a place for Jimmy Kimmel, and a place for music labels, and a place for like every single thing that's also on TV. I think that is that's something that from the like if I'm an independent creator perspective, like you're sort of always competing with traditional media, and I don't think that's going away.
Define boil the ocean.
That's a great term. I'll tease it to the audience to go out and buy the book to figure that out. But it's just like a fun. I don't know if Google invented it. It's probably like Intel or something. But it's like a problem that's so hard. Like, oh, we're going to boil the ocean, and that was a term that YouTube used for I think 3 different sort of major moments in their history.
Did these moments, can you talk about like some of them? Like what were they? What were the hallmarks of these moments? And did they work, or were they kind of just experiments? Like at which point did they say we're going to boil an ocean, and then we're pivoting to TV or premium, and then
for sure. Yeah, one of them was mobile, which worked. Like at one point in time, YouTube was mostly like a desktop thing, right? And it's like similar to Facebook. They made this pivot, and the interesting reporting in the book that I've forgotten was that Apple like controlled the like app for YouTube for its first like 5 years on iPhones. Like Steve Jobs' legacy of like we are gonna have control, and then YouTube was like, actually we'll take back control, and Apple said, okay, well you're not going to get like pre-installs on the iPhone. And so there was a concern inside Google that like, oh shit, that means that can I not drop a curse? Sorry.
Yeah, whatever.
That YouTube would like disappear from iPhones, and indeed it did not, because at that point in 2012 there was like huge consumer demand. So I think that's like a boil of the ocean that people in YouTube were proud of. I mean, the book gets into a little bit of like so much of their focus was on these things, like in the billion-hour goal, which they set around 2012 to like get to 1 billion hours a day, and they achieved that, right? And then John Doerr like talked about it in his book about OKRs. This is an example of like this crowning corporate achievement. I think there was this total blind spot, which they've admitted to now in a kind of roundabout way, like what happens when you optimize for watch time in 1 billion hours a day and you don't have the guardrails around safety, for like safety around things like hate speech and misinformation and like kids content, all these things that like really didn't exist like 6 years ago. And they've been sort of scrambling since to like build that infrastructure.
Gotcha. Greg, any final questions you have for Mark?
No, I think it's fascinating. I mean, YouTube is its own universe, really, and I think it's established an equally important, I think cultural role, right? And I guess, I guess if your thoughts are, do you think the demise of, let's not call it the demise, how much more do you think YouTube can eat from the professional content sphere, I guess is the question, right? Because, if their KPI is really like TP, right? Like we're like, all right, how much are we actually getting there? I know people who've like given up, they only watch YouTube now, right? They're not across generations, by the way, right? I am curious, like, do you think that there's significant room for growth here? There's always this quality aspect, but it used to be that the UGC was so far away, but it was so compelling that you stayed with it. But now the production value is going up as well. Do you start to get there? I mean, episodic stuff can still be done technically ad hoc. And this was the premise early on, right? Like, could people put together their own, entertainment and shows like that, right? Do you think that's what could happen still?
I mean, look at there was the Pew study that came out last week about U.S. teens and like, how much time do you spend? Like, well, the question they asked is like, how much do you, I think it was like almost daily, what do you use? And like, it was like a quarter of them said like YouTube. And that was by far the biggest of the apps, even bigger than TikTok. Go look at the Tube Filter. It's a great site. Go look at the top YouTube views for every week. It is like, without fail, kids content, like toddler stuff, Cocomelon, like these kids shows that maybe you haven't heard of unless you have a toddler. They're like racking in 300 million, 400 million, 500 million views a week. Like, I don't like, that is not slowing down. And this is an entire generation that like of kids that like doesn't watch television. They watch YouTube. To me, that's like not going anywhere.
What's the future? I mean, you talked about, we're in this new era now where YouTube is facing a lot of external challenges, not to mention internal, but largely external. You poignantly, you highlight some real tragedies in this book. The challenges of, the New Zealand.
Don't give it away, Ken.
But and regulatory issues and the like.
We all keep secrets, right?
I'm an open book here. But where does this go in the next 5 years? Like, I'm pretty sure at which point will you start to write your next book for about YouTube? Like, what's going to be in the next book?
I mean, I think like listen, two areas that certainly like who knows what's going to happen with this race against TikTok. Like, that's really fascinating. I think the more interesting questions there on the TikTok side too, of like how long can this company owned by a Chinese company sort of survive and thrive in the US, and then like are creators going to actually start moving and like staying on TikTok in a significant way that forces YouTube to address that. I also think that, like, if you look at just really broadly across the US, across the globe, the internet's going to look a lot different in many different countries. And I think YouTube will that's going to be really fascinating to watch, right? Like, you're seeing it now playing out in Russia, obviously, where YouTube is like the only media service still active, the US media service, which is kind of wild. But YouTube in Russia looks very different than YouTube outside of Russia now. YouTube in India is starting to look very different than YouTube outside of India. Same could be said for Brazil, Vietnam, Indonesia. Like, name your country that's going through a massive country that's now trying to regulate tech and going through all sorts of changes. And they were just on the Twitter Spaces earlier today talking about the midterms election, like how many other countries are going to have sort of contentious elections and what are the platforms going to do about that? The easy stuff. Yeah.
So cakewalk for YouTube. I gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
My final question, and this is, you can thank Mike Isaac for this, because well, he didn't tell me this, but I was reminded because of his book, because his book, Why Super Pump, got optioned to be a mini series on Showtime. So your book comes out September 6th. I know you're eagerly waiting the question here. Who would star? Have you thought about potential actors that would star in this movie about YouTube?
I actually do not, which is I don't know. Part of it's like, there are not, God, Julianne Moore can make a good Susan.
Okay.
I think Ken was really asking, what's his part going to be?
What's
Yes.
your part? Yeah. Play yourself, Ken.
Yes. There are no actors that can.
Can you get to be PewDiePie?
Yeah.
God no.
That's
I
a
mean,
tough role.
yeah,
It's a tough role.
I don't know. Well, but yeah. Mark, so anything else that you want to tell us, tell listeners, tell viewers about your book? I mean, obviously it comes out on September 6th. You can buy it everywhere. If you want more information, you can go to this bit.ly link that we set up, bit.ly/like, comment, subscribe. So far I've gotten pretty good reviews from what I've seen. But anything else that you want to mention about your book?
Yeah, I think, especially if you're like an online creator or you care about this, which is probably the people listening to this right now. I think like understanding this platform and this history is really important, and understanding sort of where they're headed. That's the best sense of like where they're headed, and I think the creators that have thrived are the ones that really like understand YouTube in sort of an instinctual way and spend a lot of time thinking about that. Also, like I hope and I think the book is a page turner and like a really fun narrative, even if you're not trying to like do homework and study the company. And so I wrote it that way, and I hope it's entertaining as well as informative.
And fun fact, if you are in the Bay Area, be sure to go to Mark's to bit.ly/like, comment, subscribe. There you'll be able to get tour dates, because Mark his first event will be an in-person event with our friend Casey Newton, who's the founder and editor of Platformer, on September 13th at Manny's. Thinking I might want to fly down there and
hot spot.
I know. And then you're going to do a interview with another fellow Bloomberg journalist and fellow author now, Emily Chang.
Yes, with a special guest coming to that one, actually. So stay tuned.
Oh, fun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for paying attention, for watching, and thank you, Mark, for sharing your wisdom and insights about YouTube. Really appreciate that. And for more information about it, again, go to bit.ly/like, comment, subscribe. All right. And with that,
appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
And with that, we'll
thanks so much.
We'll see you guys next time. Have a good one.